Hi everybody. My name is Cassie Dunaway, and I'm the AmeriCorps member at MountainTrue. And part of my job is to host these MountainTrue University series. If this is your first time with MountainTrue University, it's a speaker series where various members of our staff and friends of the organization give talks about areas that they work on or have expertise in. If you are interested in finding some more of these past recordings of MTU, you can find them on our website. Today, we're going to hear from MountainTrue's Western Region Program Coordinator, Tony Ward, and Tony will be discussing his role on the Bryson City Island Park project. If you are not familiar with MountainTrue, we are an environmental conservation organization that works regionally, mostly in Western North Carolina, to protect our resilient forests, our clean waters, and our healthy communities. Check out our website to find out more about what we do. Since this is a webinar, just so you know, we cannot see or hear you, but you can see and hear us. If you have any questions during the discussion, you can type them into the Q&A below, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tony.
Thank you, Cassidy, and welcome. I'm going to go through a little presentation about the Bryson City Island project. And it is a park in Bryson City that we are working on doing some invasive plant removal work. And so I have some information about a plan that I wrote back in the fall to get some of this work accomplished. And we've already had one volunteer work day, which I'll show you. So let's start off by looking at the island park. Let's see if I can make my screen advance. There we go. Did I go one too many? Nope, that's the first slide. All right, so the Bryson City Island Park is on the Tuckaseegee River, and it's right in the middle of downtown Bryson City. It's actually a natural island that is surrounded by water. There is the mouth of Deep Creek is on one side, and the Tuckaseegee River is on the other side. And it is a beautiful park with a lot of really large native trees and just a really nice place very close to downtown. Unfortunately, a couple of years back, there was some flooding with it being an island. There was some old retaining walls and some areas along the riverbank that succumbed to some of the flooding and some of the debris associated with the flooding, and the park had to be closed because of safety concerns. There were issues with people. They were worried people would get too close to the edge of the bank and that it would cave off, or some of the debris would cause someone to fall and things like that. So the park is right now closed to the public. They are working on getting it back open. And the Tuckaseegee River Alliance is a group that is working along the Tuckaseegee, and this is one of the projects that they're working on, and they have plans in the works to get some stabilization and other work done at the park in order to get it opened back up to the public. So as we began our partnership with the Tuckaseegee River Alliance, we realized that we could be very helpful in helping them manage some of the invasive plants that they have at the park. And some of that is because the park has been closed to the public, so there's not been a lot of vegetation management work done recently. So we, after a couple of meetings, decided that we wanted to write a plan to manage and eradicate the non-native invasive plants. We did a couple of site visits and had a meeting, and the Tuckaseegee River Alliance partners accepted the plan, and we began to schedule work days in order to start tackling the invasive plants that are there. So I am going to go through some of the offenders. And when I say offenders, I'm talking about the non-native invasive plant species that are present on the island park. So there are quite a few different species that are causing issues, and the main one is kudzu. The kudzu is the most prevalent because of the conditions on the island and some of the large trees either falling or aging out and dying. There were spots of sun that was opening. The canopy was opened and the sun was hitting the ground, and because of that, the kudzu really got a good foothold throughout the island. So there are a lot of areas where there are some sparse trees and some very, very large trees, but because of the sun being able to penetrate to the ground, the kudzu really spread rapidly. And kudzu being as aggressive as it is, it needs a different set of techniques in order to gain the control. And I will talk a little bit about some of those techniques that we're using to get the control of the kudzu. A lot of people think that it's impossible to get kudzu under control, and it really is possible. You just kind of have to go by a certain progression of activities in order to do that. So we'll talk about that. A couple of the other non-native invasive vines that are present are Japanese honeysuckle and English ivy. The names kind of tell you from what part of the world they're from. English ivy is actually, in this case, more prevalent than the Japanese honeysuckle, which is different than in most cases. Most cases, Japanese honeysuckle is one of the most invasive plants we encounter. I suspect that there was probably a home site or a building site on the island at some point in history, and that was when English ivy was introduced, because just the way that the plant has spread from one section of the island and is invading toward the other side of the island, I suspect that it was probably planted on that side. So to control English ivy and Japanese honeysuckle, the techniques are a little bit different. And with kudzu, there is a special chemical that you use, an herbicide chemical that is a legume specific chemical. So what that means is that when you use this herbicide and this active ingredient, it has the ability to affect the legume, which is the kudzu, and not affect the other plants that are in the vicinity of where you're treating, which is really important in the case of kudzu, because as most people know, kudzu spreads and covers everything, and it gives you the ability to overspray an area with a foliar treatment, and you're treating the kudzu and you don't have any unintentional kills of other plants that are present in that area. So being able to do that is really important, and having that specific chemical in order to do that is really important. So the way that you tackle the kudzu, firstly, is you have to get it down to ground level, which we'll talk about. But once you get it down to the ground level, then you can treat it with a foliar application. With English ivy and Japanese honeysuckle and some of these other plants that we're going to talk about, you have to use a non-specific chemical, because it's just a broadleaf chemical that you're using, and it's not as specific, so you have the potential to have affected plants that are not your target plants. So there are other techniques, including like the kudzu, severing the vines that are going up in the trees, because you don't want to be trying to do foliar treatments way up in the canopy of the trees. It's not even possible. So in the same way as kudzu, you have to get it down to ground level. But then with the English ivy and the Japanese honeysuckle, you can sever the vines at the ground level and use what's called a cut stump treatment, which is very specific to that plant that you're trying to eradicate. So you cut the plant off at ground level, and then you paint or dab a very small amount of chemical onto the cut surface of the stump of the plant, and that gives you the ability to only affect that plant that you're treating and not have any side effect plants being affected, non-target plants being affected by the work that you're doing. And also a lot of hand pulling with both of these plants, because these vines crawl along the ground and scatter in all different directions. And so you have to have, it's more labor intensive with vines, because you have to be able, as the vine crawls along the ground, it's sending roots and rooting itself as it goes. So removing as much of that biomass of that invasive plant mechanically, physically, by pulling, and then treating the areas where there are large specimens that you can't get the root system out, greatly reduces the amount of chemical that you have to use to get the invasive plant under control. So there are also a lot of different species of invasive shrubs. And these photos in this slide, the red-leaved plant is called winged burning bush, which a lot of people are familiar with as an ornamental plant. It is an invasive plant, and it has escaped in many, many areas into natural areas, and it is a problem because it's so invasive. The dark blue berries are the seed, the fruit of Chinese privet, which is probably the most prevalent invasive shrub that we have anywhere in North Carolina. And the last picture is of autumn olive, or Elaeagnus umbellata, which is a plant that was introduced as a wildlife enhancement plant and has escaped into natural areas and become invasive. So all three of these, along with a few other multiflora rose and a few other species of invasive shrubs, are present at the island park. And with these, the treatment is very similar for all these different species. And basically, the large specimens are cut at ground level, as close to the root collar as you can get. And that's important because that discourages the plant from sending sprouts from the root system after it's cut. So if you cut it and treat it with the same treatment by dabbing the concentrated herbicide onto the cut surface, that greatly reduces the amount of resprouting that you have. So then you will possibly and likely with some of these species have to come back later and do some retreatment and some spot treatments with foliar applications of a less specific herbicide in order to take care of the resprouts that do happen regardless of the treatments and some of the seedlings. Because a lot of these plants have such a huge seed bank in the soil, when you remove the large specimens, the seedlings are triggered to start to sprout. And so it takes a multi-year effort to get it under control. So on December the 12th, we had our first socially distant workday. And basically what happens is we have folks sign up and we get together socially distanced. We put on our masks and we do a little overview of the objectives for the day. And then we get out there and get to work. And the first workday, the objective was simply severing vines that were going up into the canopy because a lot of the kudzu and a lot of these other invasive vines had been there and not been managed for a long enough period of time that they were up in the canopy of the trees. So as I said before, getting that biomass down to ground level so that you can manage it the following growing season is really important, and that's the labor intensive part. So the first workday, we were able to get in there and get all of the kudzu vines severed and get all of that down to ground level. We had a great turnout, as you can see. and everybody went out onto the island, and everybody had their own little area to work in, so nobody was close together, and it was just a really, really productive, really great work day. We actually went above and beyond what I expected and planned for the day, which is always good. So the first objective, as I said, was to sever these vines, and you can see in this photo, this is English ivy. So the kudzu is actually dormant this time of year. So it just looks like gray vines going up the trees. But with the English ivy, you can really illustrate in a photo what's happening. And you can see in this photo that the portion of the English ivy that is going up into the tree has been cut. And so those vines that are going up into the tree now will die. And so that gets that infestation down to the ground level so that it can be managed later on by hand pulling, by foliar treatments, and by stump sprout or cut stump treatments. And that will be the objectives of the next work days that we have coming up, which I just so some of the other plants that we haven't really done a lot of work on the island, will be getting the plan of attack together for them on these future work days. And these plants are the Chinese privet, the burning bush, the English ivy, and the multiflora rose. And anything else that we encounter that is a shrub or a vine that is one of those species that has been known to be invasive. And the idea is just to go over the entire island and take a look at all the plant communities and make sure that we are doing the best that we can to get the invasive plants under control while still managing our work to not have any ill effects on any of the native vegetation that we can help. There are some very healthy native plant communities still present on the island despite all of the infestations. There's a lot of native shrubbery that has still managed to hold on. So I expect that once these invasive plants are taken care of, there will be an influx of native plant growth, but it's going to take a couple of growing seasons of treatments to get the invasive plants under control. So I've got just a few photos of the workday from December 12th. So this is one of the volunteers, and you can see in this photo just the snarl of vines. And Charlie here is right in the middle of the of the vines, and he's working on the tree that's behind him, severing those vines that are going up into that tree. And again, that's to bring that infestation down to that ground level so that we can manage getting the foliar applications for the kudzu, and then the second tier of hand labor for the other invasive plant species. Now, this is another volunteer who has her loppers in hand, and she's just going around severing all the vines that are going up into the trees. As those volunteers went out onto the island and spread out, it was amazing how quickly multiple people can get this work done versus one or two. And a couple more of our volunteers from that day. And there's another. So in this photo, you can see a rhododendron, which is a very slow growing, and another over by the stream. It's a very slow growing native shrub. So having those native plants present is very encouraging, because that tells me that once these invasive plants are under control, some of these like Lakotha, mountain laurel, and rhododendron will start to proliferate, and the park will be a much richer and diverse environment for wildlife, and also a much more beautiful, aesthetically pleasing park for the people who come and visit it. This is another volunteer that is crawling down under a small tree to get to the vines that are growing up, and you can see in this photo, some of those vines are actually almost as big as the tree that she's cutting them out of. So that's just the growth rate of kudzu. It just grows at such a fast rate that it will take over and cover the trees, and not, if nothing's done, eventually the smaller trees get smothered under all the mats of vegetation, and it just becomes, you know, kudzu and big trees and nothing else. So as of right now, we are working on scheduling, and we actually have workdays scheduled for February 6th and February 10th. And if you are interested in joining us and coming out and participating in these socially distant work days, there is a lot of space on the island, and it is a beautiful place and a very pleasant place to work. So I would encourage you to go to the MountainTrue website. And I think Cassidy has links on the website already for the 6th and the 10th work days that we're trying to work to get scheduled. So if you sign up for one of those work days, and then we have bad weather, we also have rain dates. And I'm sure that we will be able to get you out and helping. If you're interested in doing that, just go on to the website and get in touch with us, or follow the Tuckaseegee River Alliance on Facebook. They are partners in this project, and they are sharing the links also for the work days. The work days in the future, these next few work days are what we're calling dormant season work days. So we're actually going out with hand tools and cutting and doing stump treatments, and it's physical work, and it's actually a lot of fun. And then in the future, once the green up comes along and the growing season starts on into the spring, there will be some growing season work days where we'll be doing some spot treatments and some foliar applications. I'm a licensed applicator, so I can have folks come out and work under me, with me, in order to get that job done. So if you're interested in that, be sure to reach out. We would love to have you out to help. And there is my contact information. Again, if you go to the MountainTrue website, you can find the information for the work days, and you can find the information on the Island Park project. So I think that's all that I have. So if anybody has questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Yeah, before we get to questions, I did want to mention that the sign up form is on our website, like Tony said, mountaintrue.org. But if you go under events, that's where you will find it. And there'll be a form that you fill out there, and then you will be registered. So we do have a limit of 15 people total. So make sure you get signed up as soon as possible.
Yep.
Let's take a look at those questions. So Marnie Kaufman asked, can you join a workday if you don't live in B City?
Yes, all you have to do is sign up for the workday and come out and join us. We'd love to have you.
Does anybody else have any more questions for us? Oh, Rebecca asks, what chemical do you use for kudzu foliage?
That's a good question. So the chemical that I use is called, the brand name is Transline, and it is a legume specific chemical that has the active ingredient, I may butcher this name, but it's clopyralid, which is a legume specific chemical. So the way that the chemical works is it goes into the root system and stops growth of the legume. And it's not, in some very small number of cases, you have to be careful if there are non-target plants that are legumes. So for example, redbud trees or locust trees or soybeans or anything else that is a legume, because it's a legume specific chemical, it will also affect those plants. But for the most part, it's very useful because you can spray foliar treatments in an area where there aren't any of those other legumes, and it will affect the kudzu and not affect the other plants.
So I have another question from Joan saying, can you forward this presentation? So actually this presentation will be on Facebook and it will be on our YouTube page. But if you want to reach out to me directly, outings@mountaintrue.org, not com, I can also send it to you. So.
Also, if you have questions about chemical treatments or herbicide treatments on in any of these invasive plants that we're talking about, I'm happy to answer those questions. That's my email address, tony@mountaintrue.org. There are a lot of different ways to use chemicals that are environmentally as friendly as possible, and all the chemicals that we use are aquatic rated chemicals that are safe for aquatic invertebrates and fish and those kind of things. So I'm happy to help with any questions you may have about chemical treatments.
Rebecca asked, does it work only on foliage or also on cut stumps too?
The way that Transline is designed to work is as a foliar treatment. You can use like a glyphosate or a triclopyr chemical as a cut stump on kudzu. It is a non-specific chemical, but it has the same effect on kudzu as it has on any other plant that you use it on. The reason why we don't do more of that or don't only do that is because kudzu is such an aggressive resprouter that a lot of times if you use a chemical treatment, it just does essentially the same thing as mowing the kudzu down. And because the Transline chemical goes actually into the root system of the plant, translocates the active ingredient into its root system, and that's how it affects the kudzu. So when you do, I call it a chemical mowing, you're actually you're just knocking the plant back. So it does affect it and it will slow the growth, but the Transline is much more effective because it sometimes it takes a couple or three treatments, but the kudzu gets weaker and the infestation gets weaker with each treatment. And you know, if you have to do it twice, the last treatment is just going to be a very, very small percentage of what's left if it tries to resprout again.
So the last question from Callie that says, can regular people buy the kudzu herbicide that you're talking about?
It's actually a regulated chemical, and you have to be a licensed applicator in order to get Transline, which is probably good and bad. So yeah, it's not one of those chemicals that you can go down to the Lowe's or the Home Depot and pick up. No. And just a word about some of those chemicals, I would encourage you that if you're using weed killers, to be really careful about some of these just add water chemical formulations, because a lot of those are very, they have so many surfactants and things added to them that they're very harmful for aquatic life. So if you're anywhere near water or anywhere near an area where runoff can get to a stream, you can unintentionally do some real damage if you're not really careful.
Awesome. Well, Rebecca says thank you. And one comment in the chat from earlier says, go team, sideways smiley face.
Awesome.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I guess we'd just like to say thank you for joining us in this MountainTrue University, and we hope to see you next time.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.